speakers in this session as well.
Just wait. Okay, here I am. Okay, I'm Tula Giannini. I'm coming to you from New York, where I am at Pratt Institute as a professor. And it's certainly with great pleasure that I introduce to you our keynote speaker for this session, Dr. Stuart Dunn. And Stuart is a senior lecturer in digital humanities. Can you hear me okay, by the way? Because my voice is kind of, can you hear me? Is my, hello? Can you hear my voice?
Yes, I can do that.
All sounding good, all sounding good.
I'm just wondering if you can hear me.
Hello.
Okay, so I'll start again. Stuart is a senior lecturer in digital humanities at King's College London. He started out as an archaeologist with interests in the history of cartography. And my screen just died. Just a minute here, sorry about that, my text. And with interests in history of cartography, digital approaches to landscape studies, and spatial humanities. He has been a visiting scholar at Stanford University's Center for Electronic Spatial and Textual Analysis and the Australian National University Center for Digital Humanities. He currently works on projects in spatial narrative theory, critical GIS, Cypriot cultural heritage, and the archaeology of mobility. Stuart gained an interdisciplinary PhD on Aegean Bronze Age dating methods and paleovolcanology from the University of Durham in 2002, conducting fieldwork in Melos, Crete, and Santorini. I want to note that I first met Stuart at EVA, and for several years we collaborated on a KCL Pratt London summer school, focusing on the arts and digital culture, a subject that ties to Stuart's talk today entitled Networks of Objects or Objects of Networks, Rethinking Digital Art History Again. Let us welcome Stuart. One thing following Stuart's talk, there will be a 20-minute break. After the break, I'll be sharing the next session, which begins at 3 p.m. So welcome, Stuart. Where are you?
I'm here. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Tula. So I am now just going to start sharing my screen. Yes, I should know how to do this by now after this year, shouldn't I? Yes. Come on. Yes, there we go. So that looks like it's working from my end. Hopefully it does from yours as well. So yes, I am going to be talking about the general subject of digital art history this afternoon. And I very deliberately went out of my way not to frame this as a what is digital art history talk, because in my experience, if you give a keynote and there is any kind of permutation of what is digital subject X, that is the surefire way to get people to start checking their emails in the background. So I'm rather going to try and think through some of the epistemologies of digital art history, particularly in the light of a project that I have been working on for the past couple of years, funded by the Getty Foundation, the Ancient Itineraries project, of which I have also had the pleasure of collaborating with Tula. She has been the chair of my steering committee for this project. And I particularly want to think about the relationship between artworks and significance and networks, because I think network analysis particularly has a lot to tell us about digital curation and digital art history, and I'm going to try and explain a little bit why. So this discussion comes in the context of a exchange a few years ago between the visual scholar Johanna Drucker and the art historian Claire Bishop. So Drucker makes this distinction between what she calls digitized art history. This is artworks which have been somehow remediated in the digital world using scanning, digital imaging, or whatever, and digital art history, which is using digital ways of thinking to look at art in slightly different ways. And she goes on to say that in the context of the digital humanities, we are now looking at these computational techniques and consider the specificity of visual objects and their particular requirements and points of resistance. So the counterpoint to this is Bishop's view, which is that the digital and art tend not to get on. The concern here that Bishop articulates is that these extremely reflective and discursive questions, which art historians are concerned with, things like the invention of abstraction or impressionism or, new genres, kind of reveal, as she says there, may reveal empirical findings not highlighted before. But she says that this encourages us, this drives us in a way to make uncritical assumptions which do not draw on the bodies of theory that art history have developed over decades, if not much, much longer than that. Now, my view is somewhat between these two extremes. Going through the Ancient Itineraries project, which took the form of 2 long research institutes with 17 colleagues drawn from a variety of different backgrounds, which we will be writing up in the course of the next couple of months. My view is that digital art history is not about forcing interpretation into computational structures, but we'll do a typo there, whoops, but rather thinking about art in computational ways. And the particular computational methodology, which I've come to regard as being extremely important to this, is the visualization of networks. And that will be the crux of what I'm talking about. So, to give an example of what one might think of as digitized art history, as Drucker would have it, if we take a particularly famous and iconic artwork like the Arnolfini portrait by Van Eyck. Okay, well, there is various ways we can approach this. Even through the form of a Google image search, you get a whole variety of different results, different versions of the portrait, including ones which may not necessarily be completely drawing in on original, the original forms of the artwork. So this is simply a way into content at scale, of the kind that we've all become very familiar with in terms of our daily interactions with Google. And of course, like any other way in which Google mediates the world, this is subject to Google's search algorithms, to its ranking systems, to the way it classifies and deals with data. I would say, I think I would completely share Claire Bishop's concerns here that, there is very little being added to the theory or the practice of art history using data structures of this kind. Now, even if we were to try to cross-refer such a search with a more academically grounded infrastructure like Europeana, so a search for wedding brings back 523 images, 35 texts, 10 videos, 1 3D object. Once again, this doesn't really sort of get us very far in that sense. So this idea of digitized art history, simply allowing us to do things at scale, sometimes can help us looking for a particular artwork and looking for instances of a particular artwork, but it is all somewhat hit and miss. There are some more crowdsourcing based approaches. So the now deprecated Flickr Commons, and by the way, I was Very grateful to Anne Border for the shout out of the work that I and various others have done on academic and cultural crowdsourcing in the last few years. But the Flickr Commons essentially provided a mechanism for certified cultural institutions to share copyright cleared collections online, where they could be annotated, where metadata could be collaboratively constructed, and where kind of communal or community-based interpretations of that content could be shared. But once again, I mean, one gets the sense that the kind of object-oriented logics of the artwork are simply being reflected in object-oriented logics of the digital platform that we are dealing with. So in the course of our discussions in Ancient Itineraries, we looked at these questions, and this led us to start thinking from various different angles around key terms in art history, terms like provenance. And so in the complete spirit of don't do as I do, do as I say, here is a quotation from Wikipedia, or a definition from Wikipedia, which reminds us that provenance refers to where an object has come from, and also what has happened to it throughout the history of that object, how it has accrued value, who has owned it, how it is documented, the history of the object in itself. And I think that this ties interestingly into ideas put forward by people like Clive Gosden, who talks about the biography of objects. I think the equation of an object with a living person is quite an interesting idea. But then again, provenance in some contexts has quite a rationalistic and quite a positivist, what's the phrase, philosophy. So, in the context of the International Council of Museums, for example, provenance and the establishment of a clear provenance is, an ethical need for museums. Any object in a reputable collection must transparently display its provenance, and as such be clear about what that object is, where it has come from, and of course the history of legal and proper ownership. But this is slightly different from that more discursive art historical idea of provenance that the purist definition of the term might allow us to believe. Now, of course, yes, provenance in both senses, is hugely important to the proper conduct of the, of the art historical trade, as it were. So big organizations like Christie's, for example, place great store on the importance of provenance of articles that they agree to take on and to sell by auction. So considerations of ethics and financial valuations, cultural claims, and the construction, of course, of museum collections. But of course, provenance has a meaning in the digital world as well, which is once again rather different. So in this sense, the W3C, World Wide Web Consortium's guidelines on good practice defines provenance as, this record that describes people, institutions, entities, and activities involved in producing, influencing, or delivering a piece of data or thing. So this is again about the evolution of what happens to an object, and in the context of the World Wide Web. And another kind of good perspective on this comes from Jeremy Jarvis, who says, in the context of the web, good curation demands good provenance. Provenance is no longer merely the nicety of artists, academics, and winemakers. It is an ethic we expect. So I wonder if the confluence between the idea of provenance and the digital world has perhaps resulted in this rather reductionist concern that Claire Bishop articulated in her response to Johanna Drucker. Now, I mentioned that I've had the great pleasure of collaborating with the Getty Foundation in this project. And so I think it is worth kind of highlighting the way that the Getty has approached issues of provenance in this sense. So the Getty Provenance Index, as many of you may be aware, is a massive database which can be used for a whole range of different things. It contains a whole range of different types of example of different applications, and visualized in the soon-to-be deprecated Flash website, it looks like this. So this is a record drawing from the GPI of art dealers, of who is selling to whom and where they are based. And so from this, we can tell that London, Paris, and Amsterdam, just by looking at this, are very important centers of the art trade in this period. And this is a fabulously powerful resource. It has all sorts of applications. But I think it is interesting that in the way that it follows the logic of the network and the logic of the object equals a node in a network. So this assumes that, a network visualized in this way has to connect objects, whether those are people or places or artworks themselves. And that is the assumption that we have been taking another look at in the Ancient Itineraries project. Now, to walk through this example, we storyboarded one particular artwork, the Dancing Faun, which is exhibited at Leighton House, the former house of Lord Frederick Leighton, the Victorian traveller and antiquarian. And this is the Dancing Faun, which is on display. Leighton House, by the way, is in Kensington in West London. Now, this statue, this rather dandy Dancing Faun statue, is not an original antique. It is a copy of a statue that was found in Pompeii. And so in that sense, it has a backstory. It has a set of relationships with objects that went before, but it is not in a classical sense an antique. So what we did is we reviewed a wide variety of information sources about the Dancing Faun, about this object, which we knew not to be an authentic antique, but which nonetheless had an interesting history, and developed a set of metadata headings which referred not just to the physical attributes of the object, but to abstract attributes as well. So things like events that happened to it, places where those events happened, people associated with the object, chronological periods. And we developed a set of almost narrative segments where each of these concepts fed into that particular segment. So we tried, in a sense, to tell this wider story of the Dancing Faun through different kinds of data, as it were. And we were able to visualize this as a network graph. So we have a kind of core instance of the Dancing Faun, but then there are other instances of the faun in other places as well. There's one at the Royal Academy in London, a copy. There is a drawing of a Dancing Faun at the British Museum. Oops, gone too far. There is a version of the Dancing Faun in the Uffizi Gallery as well. So we see these as instances of the concept of the Dancing Faun, which in itself is a concept originating in Greco-Roman mythology in itself. But we were also able to use this approach to include events as nodes in this network. And as reference points to the events, we were able to use C.CRM categories. So C.CRM, for those unfamiliar, is the ICON standard for linking museum collections together. We were also able to visualize time periods, which are themselves abstract entities. So, 19th century in this case is drawn from Wikidata, or in another case, we have an instance of the Roman imperial period conceptualized as a time period in the Periodo Gazetteer. The point being for every one of these statements, for every one of these nodes in the network, we have a authoritative reference somewhere on the World Wide Web. And we are also able to use the Getty Art and Architecture thesaurus, of course we did, to include styles in this network as well. So all these different types of objects, so chronological objects, conceptual objects, event types, instances, locations, location types, academic references, and segments and styles. These all form points of significance related to this one object, to the dancing faun. And we are able to visualize it as a 3D network in a sense. And so I'm now going to have to see how well I've timed this. So we can kind of move in, we can click on a node, which is in this case a place type, which takes us to a reference in the Geonames Gazetteer. So this is the Archaeological Museum of Naples. So this is the authoritative link elsewhere on the web. The orange nodes that you see here are those physical instances of the faun, the Uffizi faun, the Royal Academy faun, the British Museum faun, and so on. So we can kind of pull those into a nice, neat group in their own right. And that's the end of that. But what this shows is that rather than treating a network in this sense as a logic which has to follow networks of objects, this visualizes one object as a network of concepts. Some of them are physical, some of them are abstract. And, I think this is really quite an interesting inversion, as it were, of network analysis. It's turning the logic of network analysis on its head. We don't have to see artworks as just one piece, in a bigger whole. This allows us to see objects as networks in their own right. So with that, I'm possibly running a little short of time. So I did want to try to leave some time for discussion. So I'm going to leave this with two important questions that I think have emerged from this project, from Ancient Itineraries. Do objects have a particular type of significance when they are artworks? And what might that significance be? This, I think, crosses some interesting epistemological and disciplinary barriers. So when an archaeologist talks of an object, for example, I used to be an archaeologist years ago, by the way, they might have a different idea of significance from when an art historian describes an object. And also, they might have a very different idea of what art history is. And secondly, does digital history have a particular type of significance when it is digital art history? And so I think that is another kind of key question space that came out of this project. What is it about those narrative sequences, those stories that we tell when we think of an object as a computationally derived network in that sense? So I'm certainly not trying to sort of referee that debate between Drucker and Bishop. That's certainly not my intention. What I'm trying to do is to set out a vision, in some sense, of how we might, as computationally thinking people, approach the problems of art history. And I think one interesting way of doing that is, as I say, inverting the logic of the network from being a collection of disparate objects to a collection of concepts focused in one object. So I think that is everything I have to say. I am going to stop sharing my screen now and hand back to Tula.
I'm back. Well, bravo, Stuart. That was very challenging. And I was thinking, being a musician as I am, Debussy, Afternoon of Faun, and that the impersonation by Nijinsky in the first performance by Ballet Russe creates an interpretation that's, in a sense, momentary. It's in time and space, but it's very powerful conceptually, and obviously comes out of this Greek myth. So that's another connection, which really kind of complicates things.
Yes, another instance, as it were.
Yeah.
The instants don't have to be objects. They can be other types of asset as well.
Do we have any other questions? This is a fantastic topic. It's too bad we can't have a long discussion now, but any other?
There's a question in the comments there, Tula.
A question?
There's a question in the comments, yeah.
Oh, okay. Is there a question in the? Yeah, I think that our historians are very influenced by these other interpretations of what becomes a conceptual idea, a myth. And so it appears in different forms. So you have both choreographers, dancers, and of course Debussy's piece, Afternoon of Faun, it plays out that concept. It's very powerful. So, and it's a regular work, so it keeps coming back. It's every year you'll find many performances of Afternoon of Faun. So the Faun lives.
I'll quickly read out the question that's in the comments there. Is there a clearly defined generic metadata standard for museum objects?
No.
There isn't. There is I think the closest thing would be the C.CRM, which describes how collections should be linked together, but that depends on individual collections in being in some way compliant with the CRM standards. So there is no universal way of doing it, which is one of the things that keeps museology interesting, I guess.
Okay, Tula, I think we're at 4 o'clock or 3 o'clock, so in UK time. So maybe it's time for the short break.
Yes. I hope everyone enjoys their break, and we'll see you back. It's a 20-minute break in 20 minutes. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. Wonderful.